Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Historical tales for sleep. Close your eyes. Imagine fields drowned by unending rain, bread crumbling in your hands, hunger that hollowed hope, and a world where survival was brutal. This was medieval Europe, not distant myth, but daily life shaped by hunger and hardship. The Great Famine continent collapses in the spring of 1315. Torrential rain and severe cold destroyed harvests across northern Europe. Grain rotted in the fields, livestock perished, and bread became a luxury few could afford. Some peasants were forced to eat roots, bark, or worse. Entire villages died or were abandoned, showing a collective breakdown of medieval society. 10 Things to know about the Great Famine. One of the most severe crises to strike medieval Europe was the Great Famine, beginning in the year 1315. Much of northern Europe would face years of bad weather, crop failures, and widespread deaths from disease and starvation. Parts of the continent would not recover for 7 years. Two of most well-known books about the topic are The Great Famine, Northern Europe in the early 14th century, by William Chester Jordan, and The Third Horseman, A Story of Weather, War and the Famine History Forgot, by William Rosen. Both offer a good starting point to learn about the events of 1315 to 22. And here are 10 important points they offer about the Great Famine. Jordan explains that the Great Famine could be found in Ireland, Great Britain, France, the Low Countries, much of Germany, and parts of Poland, Austria, and Scandinavia, an area of 400,000 square miles that was home to an estimated population of 30 million. 2. Huge amounts of rain. The year 1315 saw drastic weather, most notably lengthy periods of rain, which caused flooding and left agricultural fields waterlogged. Rosen adds that the flooding and storm activity were devastating for coastal areas as the rising seas reclaimed shoreline communities. For example, more than 2,000 acres of one-time marshland that had been converted to cropland in 8 villages in Sussex were submerged. Dunwich, which was one of the 5 wealthiest ports in England in the late 13th century, was so devastated by one flood after another that 269 houses, including crofts and barns, 10 other buildings, and 2 shops disappeared, fully a quarter of the entire port town. By the 1330s, most of the 5 parishes of the town, and up to 600 houses, had been reclaimed by the newly unstable sea. 3. Decline in agricultural yields. The constant rains of 1315, which would continue into 1316 and 1317, left farmland so poor that it could not sustain the yields typical of medieval farming. While it is believed that in the 13th century one could harvest as much as 10 bushels of wheat for every bushel sown, during the early years of the famine this production was cut by between 1/3 to 1/2. The results were similar for other kinds of crops. For animals were hit hard. 2 chroniclers also described how sheep, cows, and horses were also suffering from the bad weather, which led to diseases called murrains. Herds would be depleted as animals weakened and died. The records from Ramsey Abbey in England show that cattle herds' declines were catastrophic in one manner only. 6 of 48 animals survived, while in another the number of cows went from 45 to 2.5 villages abandoned. Jordan notes that some peasant communities in Europe were simply abandoned, especially in Ireland and the Lübeck region of northern Germany, as the people decided these places were no longer able to recover. Coastal areas in the Netherlands also saw large-scale population declines as the flooding forced people to find new homes. In the following years, many chroniclers would report on roaming bands of landless peasants who would come to cities looking for work or food. 6. The crisis hit the upper classes. The landowners of medieval Europe, monarchs, nobles, and the church, saw the value of their domains collapse and revenues plummet. Lands would be sold, often at drastically reduced prices, while many others would needed loans to survive. Some smaller monasteries and nunneries decided to close up, while larger institutions such as Canterbury Cathedral, Priory sold off relics to pilgrims in order to raise cash. 7 efforts to provide help. Medieval governments and individuals attempted to find ways to mitigate the disaster and bring relief to the people. This included setting up price controls and arranging for food to be imported from southern Europe. Jordan writes, there was a spate of hospital and hospice foundations in the years of the Great Famine that gives one pause. Perhaps not all of the foundations were direct response to the famine, but the founders' timing could hardly have been indifferent to the suffering they saw about them. 8 War makes matters worse. The ongoing famine was exacerbated by the many conflicts that was taking place in Europe at the time. Following his victory at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, the Scottish King Robert the Bruce was fighting the English along their border, and in Ireland, Germany saw a war between Ludwig of Bavaria against Frederick of Austria, while the Kingdom of France was continuing its conflict with Flanders. Add to this ongoing wars in Scandinavia and a revolt in Wales. These various campaigns would see more resources being depleted, while some lands suffered from raids and destruction, which added to the general misery of the time. 9 The survivors would be hit by the Black Death, though the massive plague that struck Europe took place about 30 years after the Great Famine. The latter was likely a contributing factor to this disaster as well. Children who grow up with malnutrition often see their immune systems become less effective against disease, even over the long term. Those who grew up in the first decades of the 14th century would have been more vulnerable to the pandemic. 10 The legends and stories that were told. The popular German folk tale Hansel and Gretel, in which 2 children are abandoned in the woods by their family during a famine and are almost eaten by a witch, is believed to have originated in the 14th century. It is not surprising to think that many legends involving famine might be linked to the events of 1315 to 22, when people may have resorted to abandoning the weak or even cannibalism. The shadow of hunger, social disintegration. As hunger deepened, communities unraveled. The starving grew weak and vulnerable to diseases like pneumonia and dysentery. Lawlessness. Many resorted to theft, abandonment of children, and even rumors of cannibalism. The very bonds between lord and peasant broke under desperation. The Great Famine, Europe's forgotten catastrophe. The early 14th century in Europe is often remembered for the Black Death, but before the plague swept across the continent, another disaster struck, the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. This devastating event marked the end of centuries of relative prosperity and growth, plunging much of Europe into years of hunger, disease, social upheaval, and mass mortality. The Great Famine's impact was so profound that it shaped the course of European history for generations to come. A prosperous Europe on the brink. For centuries leading up to 1315, Europe experienced a period of expansion and relative stability. This era, sometimes called the High Middle Ages, saw the population triple due to advancements in agriculture, such as the heavy plough and 3-field crop rotation. The generally warm and stable climate of the medieval climate anomaly allowed farmers to cultivate marginal lands, supporting a population boom. However, this prosperity was fragile. The population had grown to the limits of what the land could support, and food reserves were minimal for all but the wealthiest. Even a modest drop in harvests could spell disaster for millions. The onset, unrelenting rain and failed harvests. The catastrophe began in the spring of 1315, when Europe was struck by unusually heavy and persistent rains. These deluges continued through the summer, accompanied by abnormally cool temperatures. The result was catastrophic for agriculture. Grain could not ripen, and fields became waterlogged, making ploughing and planting impossible. Hay and straw for livestock could not be dried, leading to a shortage of fodder and widespread animal deaths. Flooding affected lowland areas, especially in England, where entire regions were submerged and infrastructure destroyed. The rains did not relent in 1316, and by 1317, Europe was in the grip of a full-blown famine. Crop failures were near total in some regions, and livestock populations collapsed as disease and starvation took hold. In some areas, cattle and sheep numbers fell by as much as 80%. Economic collapse and soaring prices as food became scarce. Prices skyrocketed. In England, the price of food doubled between spring and midsummer of 1315. In Lorraine, wheat prices rose by 320%, making bread a dietary staple, unaffordable for peasants. Salt, essential for preserving meat, became scarce as wet conditions made evaporation impossible, further compounding the crisis. The government attempted to intervene. In England, King Edward II's Parliament issued price controls in 1316. But these measures proved ineffective in the face of overwhelming scarcity and black market activity. Desperation and social breakdown, the famine's effects rippled through every layer of society. Hunger and disease, weakened by malnutrition, people succumbed to diseases such as pneumonia, tuberculosis, and dysentery. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Crime and social unrest, desperate for food, people resorted to theft, violence, and even murder. There were widespread reports of parents abandoning children, and of people eating dogs, horses, and, in the most extreme cases, rumors of cannibalism. Breakdown of order, lawlessness increased, and local authorities struggled to maintain control. The social contract between lords and peasants frayed, and faith in the church and monarchy was shaken as prayers and processions failed to bring relief. Why was the famine so severe? Several factors combined to make the Great Famine uniquely devastating. Climate change, the end of the medieval climate anomaly, and the onset of the Little Ice Age brought colder, wetter weather to northern Europe, disrupting agricultural cycles. Population pressure. Centuries of population growth had stretched resources thin. There were few reserves, and even the nobility and clergy were not immune to shortages. Livestock disease, malnourished animals were more susceptible to disease, leading to a collapse in meat and dairy production. Limited relief, medieval transportation, and storage systems were primitive. Food could not be easily moved from surplus to deficit regions, and spoilage was common. Economic vulnerability. The economy was heavily reliant on agriculture. When crops failed, there were few alternatives for work or sustenance. The human estimates of mortality vary, but historians believe that between 5% and 12% of the population of northern Europe died from starvation or related diseases during the famine years. In some regions, the toll was even higher. Chronicles described entire villages abandoned, fields left fallow, and the countryside dotted with mass graves. The famine's effects lingered long after the rains stopped. Even after harvests returned to normal in 1317, it took years for food, supplies, and livestock herds to recover. Many who survived were weakened, making them more susceptible to disease, including the Black Death, which would strike just a generation later. long-term consequences. The Great Famine had profound and lasting effects on European society. Demographic shifts. The population decline created labor shortages, which eventually contributed to the weakening of feudalism as peasants gained more bargaining power. Economic changes. With fewer mouths to feed, wages for laborers began to rise, and the rigid social hierarchy of the Middle Ages began to erode. Psychological impact. The trauma of mass starvation and social breakdown left deep scars. Faith in traditional authorities, both secular and religious, was shaken, setting the stage for future upheavals. Prelude to crisis. The famine was the first in a series of calamities that struck Europe in the 14th century, including the Black Death and the 100 Years' War. It marked the end of the High Middle Ages and the beginning of a more turbulent era. Climate crisis and the Great Famine mode. Modern research has shed new light on the climatic causes of the famine. Tree ring data and historical records confirm that the years 1314-1316 were among the wettest in over 700 years. Scientists have identified a pattern of hydroclimatic variability, termed the Great Famine mode, that underlies some of the most severe droughts and floods in European history. This research underscores the vulnerability of pre-modern societies to climate shocks, especially when combined with demographic and economic pressures. Lessons from the Great Famine. The Great Famine of 1315-1317 is a stark reminder of the fragility of human societies in the face of environmental change. Its legacy can be seen in the social, economic, and political transformations that reshaped Europe in the centuries that followed. Vulnerability to climate. Even advanced societies can be brought to their knees by sustained climate anomalies. Importance of reserves. The lack of food storage and distribution systems made the crisis far worse. Social resilience. The famine tested the limits of social order, revealing both the strengths and weaknesses of medieval institutions. While the Great Famine is less well known than the Black Death, its impact was arguably just as profound. It marked the end of an age, the beginning of another, and serves as a powerful cautionary tale for our own times. Daily vicious cycle labor. No reward. Peasants labored from dawn to dusk with crude tools. Homes were cramped, unsanitary, often shared with livestock, and offered little protection from winter's cold. Meals were sparse barley bread, pottage, or stale, ale packed with calories but not nourishment. Malnutrition and exposure claimed lives more than any disease. Peasant life in medieval Europe. A glimpse into daily struggles. Medieval Europe was marked by a hierarchical social structure, with peasants constituting the largest class. Peasants formed the foundation of medieval society, comprising the majority of the population. While the lives of the nobility and clergy have often been extensively studied, the daily struggles and experiences of peasants have received less attention. This article aims to provide a glimpse into the life of medieval peasants, focusing on their challenges, daily routines, and the legacy they left behind. The feudal system and peasantry. Medieval Europe was characterized by a feudal system, a social and economic structure that governed the relationships between the ruling classes and the peasantry. Peasants, also known as serfs, were tied to the land they worked on and were obligated to provide labor and resources to the lord of the manor in exchange for protection. They had limited freedom and were subject to the whims of their lords, who held significant power over their lives. Daily challenges and hardships. Peasants faced numerous challenges and hardships throughout their daily lives. They toiled from sunrise to sunset, engaging in back-breaking agricultural labor, often with insufficient tools and technology. Constant physical labor, combined with poor nutrition, led to a high prevalence of diseases and shorter lifespans among peasants compared to the upper classes. Additionally, peasants were vulnerable to natural disasters such as droughts, floods, and pests, which could devastate their crops and livelihoods. Agricultural labor and farming techniques. Agriculture formed the backbone of medieval peasant life. Peasants typically cultivated a variety of crops, primarily cereals like wheat, barley, and oats, as well as vegetables and fruits. They employed simple farming techniques, using crude plows and wooden tools to till the soil. Crop rotation, a common practice, helped maintain soil fertility. However, the lack of scientific knowledge and limited resources meant that yields were often low, contributing to food insecurity and dependence on agriculture. Role of women in peasant society. Women played a crucial role in medieval peasant society. They shared the burden of agricultural labor alongside men, working in the fields and tending to livestock. In addition to their agricultural responsibilities, women managed the household, cared for children, and often participated in cottage industries to supplement their family's income. Despite their indispensable contributions, women faced limited rights, societal restrictions, and a lack of formal recognition. Food and diet of medieval peasants. The diet of medieval peasants was predominantly based on locally available and affordable food sources. Their meals consisted mainly of grains, such as bread and porridge, along with vegetables, legumes, and occasionally meat. The scarcity of resources meant that meat consumption was a luxury reserved for special occasions. Peasants brewed their own ale and relied on communal baking ovens for bread production. The monotonous and nutritionally deficient diet of peasants contributed to their susceptibility to diseases and malnutrition. Housing and living conditions. Medieval peasants lived in simple, cramped dwellings made of earth, wood, and thatch. Houses were often shared by both humans and livestock, lacking proper sanitation and ventilation. Privacy was a luxury, as multiple generations of a family would occupy a single room. The lack of heating and insulation made winters particularly harsh, leading to frequent illnesses. Peasant settlements were often clustered around the lord's manor for protection and labor. Convenience. Health and medical care. Peasants had limited access to healthcare and medical services. Local healers, often women, relied on traditional remedies and herbal medicine to treat common ailments. However, serious diseases and injuries posed significant challenges due to the lack of advanced medical knowledge. Peasants often turned to superstitions and religious practices for protection and healing. Monastic infirmaries occasionally provided basic medical assistance, but these were inaccessible to most rural peasants. Religious beliefs and practices. Religion played a central role in the lives of medieval peasants. The Catholic Church held considerable influence, and peasants attended regular religious services. Seeking solace and guidance in their daily struggles, they believed in the supernatural, with a deep fear of demons and witches. Peasants made regular pilgrimages to holy sites and sought blessings from local saints to ensure divine protection and prosperity. The Church also reinforced the social order and emphasized obedience to the ruling classes. Education and literacy among peasants. Education and literacy were rare among medieval peasants. The majority were illiterate and had limited access to formal education. Basic skills, such as farming techniques, were passed down through generations within families and communities. Monastic schools, where they existed, offered education primarily to the nobility and clergy. Peasants rarely had the opportunity to acquire reading and writing skills. which further reinforced their dependency on the ruling classes. Peasant revolts and social unrest. The harsh conditions faced by medieval peasants occasionally led to social unrest and uprisings. Peasant revolts, such as the Jacquerie in France and the Peasants' Revolt in England, were responses to oppressive feudal systems and unfair labor conditions. These rebellions often resulted in violent clashes and were met with brutal suppression by the ruling classes. Although revolts were frequently crushed, they contributed to the slow erosion of the feudal system and the eventual rise of social change. Medieval peasants made significant contributions to the development of European society. Their labor and expertise in agriculture formed the backbone of the economy, ensuring food production and economic stability. The struggles they endured and the social unrest they sparked played a crucial role in the gradual dismantling of the feudal system. While their daily lives were filled with challenges and hardships, peasants left a lasting legacy that shaped the course of European history. Understanding their experiences provides valuable insights into the complexities and dynamics of medieval society. Famines, ripple migration, reform, and rupture. The famine devastated feudal economies. Many abandoned their land, and thousands of villages were deserted. This disrupted agricultural production, weakened manorial authority, and forced monarchs to reconsider fiscal and social norms. The crisis set the stage for labor reforms and shifting power dynamics. Consequences of the Black Death. The Black Death peaked in Europe between 1348 and 1350, with an estimated third of the continent's population ultimately succumbing to the disease, often simply referred to as the plague. The Black Death had both immediate and long-term effects on human population across the world as one of the most devastating pandemics in human history, including a series of biological, social, economic, political, and religious upheavals that had profound effects on the course of world history, especially European history. Symptoms of the bubonic plague included painful and enlarged or swollen lymph nodes, headaches, chills, fatigue, vomiting, and fevers. And within 3 to 5 days, 80% of the victims would be dead. Historians estimate that it reduced the total world population from 475 million to between 350 and 375 million. In most parts of Europe, it took nearly 80 years for population sizes to recover, and in some areas, it took more than 150 years, not verified in body from the perspective of many of the survivors. The effect of the plague may have been ultimately favorable, as the massive reduction of the workforce meant their labor was suddenly in higher demand. R.H. Hilton has argued that the English peasants who survived found their situation to be much improved. For many Europeans, the 15th century was a golden age of prosperity and new opportunities. The land was plentiful, wages were high, and serfdom had all but disappeared. A century later, as population growth resumed, the lower classes once again faced deprivation and famine. Figures for the death toll vary widely by area and from source to source, and estimates are frequently revised as historical research brings new discoveries to light. Most scholars estimate that the Black Death killed up to 75 million people in the 14th century, at a time when the entire world population was still less than 500 million. Even where the historical record is considered reliable, only rough estimates of the total number of deaths from the plague are possible. Europe suffered an especially significant death toll from the plague. Modern estimates range between roughly 1/3 and 1/2 of the total European population in the 5-year period of 1347 to 1351, died, during which the most severely affected areas may have lost up to 80% of the population contemporary chronicler Jean Froissart estimated the toll to be 100, which modern scholars consider less an accurate assessment than an allusion to the Book of Revelation meant to suggest the scope of the plague. Deaths were not evenly distributed across Europe, and some areas were affected very little, but others were all but entirely depopulated. The Black Death hit the culture of towns and cities disproportionately hard, although rural areas, where most of the population lived at the time, were also significantly affected. Larger cities were the worst off, as population densities and close living quarters made disease transmission easier. Cities were also strikingly filthy, infested with lice, fleas, and rats, and subject to diseases caused by malnutrition and poor hygiene. The population of the city of Florence was reduced from between 110,000 and 120,000 inhabitants in 1338 to 50,000 in 1351. In the cities of Hamburg and Bremen, 60 to 70% of the inhabitants died. In Provence, Dauphine, and Normandy, historians observe a decrease of 60% of fiscal hearths. In some regions, 2/3 of the population was annihilated. In the town of Givery, in the Bourgogne region of France, the local friar, who used to note 28 to 29 funerals a year, recorded 649 deaths in 1348, half of them in September. About half the population of Pepyang died over the course of several months. Only 2 of the 8 physicians survived the plague. Over 60% of Norway's population died between 1348 and 1350. London may have lost 2/3 of its population during the 1348 to 49 outbreak. England as a whole may have lost 70% of its population, which declined from 7 million before the plague to 2 million in 1400. A study by archaeologist and historian Scott C. Lomax suggested that mortality in Nottingham, England, was approximately 60%. Some places, including the Kingdom of Poland, parts of Hungary, the Brabant region, Hainaut, and Limburg in modern Belgium, as well as Santiago de Compostela, were unaffected for unknown reasons. Some historians have assumed that the presence of resistant blood groups in the local population helped them resist infection, but the regions were touched by the second plague outbreak. In 1362-1363, the little mortality, and later during the numerous resurgences of the plague in 1366-1369, 1374-75, 1400, 1407, etc. Other areas escaping the plague were isolated in mountainous regions such as the Pyrenees. All social classes were affected, but the lower classes, living together in unhealthy places, were most vulnerable. Alfonso XI of Castile and Joan of Navarre, daughter of Louis X, La Hutin, and Margaret of Burgundy, were the only European monarchs to die of the plague. Citation needed, but Peter IV of Aragon lost his wife, his daughter, and a niece in 6 months. Joan of England, daughter of Edward III, died in Bordeaux on her way to Castile to marry Alfonso's son Pedro. The Byzantine emperor lost his son, while in the Kingdom of France, Bonne of Luxembourg, the wife of the future John II of France, died of the plague. Simeon of Moscow and his brother likely died of the plague, along with Theognostus, the head of the Russian Church. Asia estimates of the demographic effect of the plague in Asia are based on population figures during the time and estimates of the disease's toll on population centers. The most severe outbreak of plague in the Chinese province of Hubei in 1334 claimed up to 80% of the population. Citation needed. China had several epidemics and famines from 1200 to the 1350s, and its population decreased from an estimated 125 million to 65 million in the late 14th century. The precise demographic effect of the disease in the Middle East is very difficult to calculate. Mortality was particularly high in rural areas, including significant areas of Gaza and Syria. Many rural people fled, leaving their fields and crops, and entire rural provinces are recorded as being totally depopulated. Surviving records in some cities reveal a devastating number of deaths. The 1348 outbreak in Gaza left an estimated 10,000 people dead, and Aleppo recorded a death rate of 500 per day during the same year. In Damascus, at the disease's peak in September and October 1348, 1,000 deaths were recorded every day, with overall mortality estimated at between 25 and 38%. Syria had lost a total of 400,000 people when the epidemic subsided in March 1349. In contrast to some higher mortality estimates in Asia and Europe, scholars such as John Fields of Trinity College, Dublin, believe the mortality rate in the Middle East to have been less than 1/3 of the total population, with higher rates in selected areas. Social, environmental, and economic effects, because 14th century healers were at a loss to explain the cause of the Black Death. Many Europeans believed supernatural forces, earthquakes, and malicious conspiracies were credible explanations for the plague's emergence. No one in the 14th century considered rat control a way to ward off the plague, and people began to believe that only God's anger could produce such horrific displays of suffering and death. Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian writer and poet of the era, questioned whether it was sent by God for their correction, or if it came through the influence of the heavenly bodies. Christians accused Jews of poisoning public water supplies, and alleged that Jews were making an effort to ruin European civilization. The spreading of those rumors led to the complete destruction of entire Jewish towns. In February 1349, 2,000 Jews were murdered in Strasbourg. In August that year, the Jewish communities of Mainz and Cologne were murdered where government authorities were concerned. Most monarchs instituted measures that prohibited exports of foodstuffs, condemned black market speculators, set price controls on grain, and outlawed large-scale fishing. At best, those proved mostly uninfruitful. At worst, they contributed to a continental downward spiral. The hardest hit lands, like England, were unable to buy grain abroad from France because of the prohibition, and from most of the rest of the grain producers because of crop failures from shortage of labor. Any grain that could be shipped was eventually taken by pirates or looters to be sold on the black market. Meanwhile, many of the largest countries, most notably England and Scotland, had been at war, used up much of their treasury, which exacerbated inflation. In 1337, on the eve of the first wave of the Black Death, England and France went to war in what would become known as the 100 Years' War. Malnutrition, poverty, disease and hunger, coupled with war, growing inflation and other economic concerns, made Europe in the mid-14th century ripe for tragedy. The historian Walter Scheidel contends that waves of plague following the initial outbreak of the Black Death had a leveling effect, which changed the ratio of land to labor by reducing the value of the former and boosting that of the latter, which lowered economic inequality by making landowners and employers less well off and improved the lot of the workers. The observed improvement in living standards of the laboring population was rooted in the suffering and premature death of tens of millions over the course of several generations. The leveling effect was reversed by a demographic recovery that resulted in renewed population pressure. On the other hand, in the quarter century after the Black Death, many laborers, artisans, and craftsmen, those living from money wages, alone suffer a reduction in real incomes in England from rampant inflation. In 1357, a third of property in London was unused because of a severe outbreak in 1348–49. However, for reasons still debated, population levels declined after the Black Death's first outbreak until around 1420 and did not begin to rise again until 1470, and so the initial Black Death event on its own does not entirely provide a satisfactory explanation to that extended period of decline in prosperity. See medieval demography for a more complete treatment of this issue and current theories on why improvements in living standards took longer to evolve. The trade disruptions in the Mongol Empire caused by the Black Death was one of the reasons. For its collapse, peasantry, the great population loss brought favourable results to the surviving peasants in England and the rest of Western Europe. There was increased social mobility, as depopulation further eroded the peasants' already weakened obligations to remain on their traditional holdings. Seigneurialism never recovered. Land was plentiful, wages high, and serfdom had all but disappeared. It was possible to move about and rise higher in life. Younger sons and women especially benefited, as population growth resumed. However, peasants again faced deprivation and famine in Eastern Europe. By contrast, renewed stringency of laws tied the remaining peasantry more tightly to the land than ever before through serf. Furthermore, the plague's great population reduction brought cheaper land prices, more food for the average peasant, and a relatively large increase in per capita income among the peasantry, if not immediately, in the coming century. Since the plague left vast areas of farmland untended, they were made available for pasture and put more meat on the market. The consumption of meat and dairy products went up, as did the export of beef and butter from the Low Countries, Scandinavia and northern Germany. However, the upper class often attempted to stop the changes, initially in Western Europe and more forcefully and successfully in Eastern Europe. By instituting sumptuary laws, they regulated what people, particularly of the peasant class, could wear, so that nobles could ensure that peasants did not begin to dress and act as a higher class member with their increased wealth. Another tactic was to fix prices and wages, so that peasants could not demand more with increasing value. In England, the Statute of Labourers 1351 was enforced, which stated that no peasant could ask for more wages than in 1346. That was met with varying success, depending on the amount of rebellion it inspired. Such a law was one of the causes of the 1381 peasants' revolt in England. The rapid development of the use was probably one of the consequences of the Black Death, during which many landowning nobles died and left their realty to their widows and minor orphans. Urban workers in the wake of the drastic population decline brought on by the plague. Wages shot up, and labourers could move to new localities in response to wage offers. Local and royal authorities in Western Europe instituted wage controls. The government controls sought to freeze wages at the old levels before the Black Death. Within England, for example, the Ordinance of Labourers, enacted in 1349, and the Statute of Labourers, enacted in 1351, restricted both wage increases and the relocation of workers. If workers attempted to leave their current post, employers were given the right to have them imprisoned. The statute was poorly enforced in most areas, and farm wages in England on average doubled between 1350 and 1450, but they were then static until the late 19th century. Cohn, comparing numerous countries, argues that the laws were not designed primarily to freeze wages. Instead, He says that the energetic local and royal measures to control labor and artisans' prices were responses to elite fears of the greed and the possible new powers of the lesser classes that had gained new freedom. Cohn continues that the laws reflected the anxiety that followed the Black Death's new horrors of mass mortality and destruction, and from elite anxiety about manifestations such as the flagellant movement and the persecution of Jews in Sicily and beggars. Labor-saving adaptations. The Black Death encouraged innovation of labor-saving technologies, leading to higher productivity. There was also a shift from grain farming to animal husbandry. Grain farming was very labor-intensive, but animal husbandry needed only a shepherd and a few dogs and pasture land. By 1200, virtually all of the Mediterranean basin and most of northern Germany had been deforested and cultivated. Indigenous flora and fauna were replaced by domestic grasses and animals, and domestic woodlands were lost. With depopulation, the process was reversed. Much of the primeval vegetation returned, and abandoned fields and pastures were land contracts and end of serfdom plague brought an eventual end of serfdom in Western Europe. The manorial system was already in trouble, but the Black Death assured its demise throughout much of Western and Central Europe by 1500. Severe depopulation and migration of the village. Two cities caused an acute shortage of agricultural labourers. Many villages were abandoned. In England, more than 1,300 villages were deserted between 1350 and 1500. Wages of labourers were high, but the rise in nominal wages after the Black Death was swamped by inflation, and so real wages fell. Labour was in such a short supply that landlords were forced to give better terms of tenure that resulted in much lower rents in Western Europe. By 1500, a new form of tenure called copyhold became prevalent in Europe. In copyhold, both a landlord and peasant made their best business deal, whereby the peasant got use of the land and the landlord got a fixed annual payment, and both possessed a copy of the tenure agreement. Serfdom did not end everywhere and lingered in parts of Western Europe and was introduced to Eastern Europe only after the Black Death. There was also a change in inheritance law. Before the plague, only sons, especially the eldest son, inherited the ancestral property. After the plague, all sons and daughters started to inherit property. Persecutions renewed. Religious fervor and fanaticism came in the wake of the Black Death. Some Europeans targeted groups such as Jews, friars, foreigners, beggars, pilgrims, lepers and Romani, who were thought to have caused the crisis. Differences in cultural and lifestyle practices also led to persecution. As the plague swept across Europe in the mid-14th century, annihilating more than half the population, Jews became scapegoats. Partly because better hygiene among Jewish communities and their isolation in ghettos meant that Jews were less affected. Accusations spread that Jews had caused the disease by deliberately poisoning wells. Mobs attacked Jewish settlements across Europe. By 1351, 60 major and 150 smaller Jewish communities had been destroyed, and more than 350 separate massacres had occurred. According to Joseph P. Byrne, women also faced persecution during the Black Death. Muslim women in Cairo became scapegoats when the plague struck. Byrne writes that in 1438, the Sultan of Cairo was informed by his religious lawyers that the arrival of the plague was Allah's punishment for the sin of fornication, and that, in accordance with that theory, a law was set in place stating that women were not allowed to make public appearances, as they may tempt men into sin. Byrne describes that law as being lifted only when the wealthy complained that their female servants could not shop for food. Religion. The Black Death hit the monasteries very hard because of their proximity with the sick who sought refuge there. That left a severe shortage of clergy after the epidemic cycle. Eventually, the losses were replaced by hasty and inexperienced clergy members, many of whom knew little of the rigors of their predecessors. New colleges were opened at established universities, and the training process was sped up. The shortage of priests opened new opportunities for laywomen to assume more extensive and more important service roles in the local parish, practiced self-flogging whipping of oneself to atone for sins. The movement became popular after the Black Death. It may be that the flagellant's later involvement in hedonism was an effort to accelerate, to absorb God's wrath, and to shorten the time with which others suffered. More likely, the focus of attention and popularity of their cause contributed to a sense that the world itself was ending, and that their individual actions were of no consequence. Reformers rarely pointed to failures on the part of the Church in dealing with the catastrophic cultural effects. The Black Death had profound effects on art and literature. After 1350, European culture in general turned very morbid. The general mood was one of pessimism, and contemporary art turned dark with representations of death. The widespread image of the Dance of Death showed death a skeleton choosing victims at random. The skeletons in the Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre paintings, often are of different social classes dancing together, representing how no amount of wealth can save one from death. The painting motif was first found as fresco on a wall in a Paris cemetery and emphasizes how the living will someday join the dead. Many of the most graphic depictions come from writers such as Boccaccio and Petrarch. Pierre Lunel de Montaigne, writing about 1348 in the lyric style long out of fashion, composed the following sorrowful savants: Maravilach nous de vos, palos gens, during the height of the plague in Toulouse. They died by the hundreds, both day and night, and all were thrown in ditches and covered with earth, and as soon as those ditches were filled, more were dug, and I, Agnolo di Tura, buried my 5 children with my own hands, and so many died that all believed it was the end of the world. Literary influences: how many valiant men, how many fair ladies, breakfast with their kinfolk, and the same night supped with their ancestors in the next world. The condition of the people was pitiable to behold. They sickened by the thousands daily, and died unattended and without help. Many died in the open street, others dying in their houses, made it known by the stench of their rotting bodies. Consecrated churchyards did not suffice for the burial of the vast multitude of bodies, which were heaped by the hundreds in vast trenches, like goods in a ship's hold and covered with a little earth. Another common painting motif that originated from the Black Death was called 3 living meet the 3 dead, which depicts 3 living people encountering 3 corpses, reminding the living of their inevitable fate. Medicine. Although the Black Death highlighted the shortcomings of medical science in the Middle Ages, it also led to positive changes in the field of medicine, as described by David Herlihy in The Black Death and the Transformation of the West. More emphasis was placed on anatomical investigations after the Black Death. The way that individuals studied the human body notably changed, and became a process that dealt more directly with the human body in varied states of sickness and health. Furthermore, the importance of surgeons became more evident. Theory put forth by Stephen O'Brien is that the Black Death is likely responsible by natural selection for the high frequency of the CCR5 delta 3-2 genetic defect in people of European descent. The gene affects T-cell function and provides protection against HIV, smallpox, and possibly plague. but for the last, no explanation exists on how it would do that. However, that is now challenged since the CCR5 Delta 3-2 gene has been found to be just as common in Bronze Age tissue samples architecture. The Black Death also inspired European architecture to move into different directions. 1. A revival of Greco-Roman styles, and 2. A further elaboration of the Gothic style. Late medieval churches had impressive structures, centered on verticality in which one's eye is drawn up towards the high ceiling. The basic Gothic style was revamped with elaborate decoration in the late medieval period. Sculptors in Italian city-states emulated the work of their Roman forefathers, and sculptors in Northern Europe, no doubt inspired by the devastation they had witnessed, gave way to a heightened expression of emotion and an emphasis on individual differences. A tough realism came forth in architecture as in literature. Images of intense sorrow, decaying corpses, and individuals with faults as well as virtues emerged. North of the Alps, painting reached a pinnacle of precise realism with early Dutch painting by artists such as Jan van Eyck c. 1392–1441. The natural world was reproduced in those works with meticulous detail, whose realism was not unlike photography.